Today's the day we celebrate the resurrection, but did you know that there were resurrections before the resurrection? Like when we talk capital R resurrection, there were resurrections before that. You can be queued up, Dov, thank you. There were resurrections before the resurrection. The Old Testament actually tells 3 different stories. They all come from the lives of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, of people being raised from the dead. Throughout the gospel stories, there are actually 3 narratives as well in which Jesus raises somebody from the dead. There's a funeral procession happening for a widow who has lost her son, and in the midst of that, Jesus raises the son from the dead. There's another funeral happening where a young girl had died and she was laid to rest in an upper room, and Jesus goes in and he raises her from the dead. And then there's a story we're talking about today from John chapter 11 where a guy named Lazarus is resurrected. He is raised from the dead. In fact, in first century Judaism, there may not have been anything more controversial than the belief in the resurrection. One group of Jews, the Pharisees, said there was a resurrection and it was something we were meant to hope in. Another group of Jews, the Sadducees, said there is no such thing as a resurrection and you should just live life to the fullest and according to the law of Moses. I was in India a couple of years ago, and I was sitting in this room with a pastor who told me that he had witnessed somebody raised from the dead. In that moment, he's telling this story of this boy in this village where he had been, and he had been going back and forth between these 2 villages, and this boy had died, and it had been multiple days, and he arrived in this village, and he was praying, and this pastor told me, he's like, I'll be honest, I did not really think he was going to raise from the dead. I just knew I had to pray. And he said the boy was revived and came to life. And I'm sitting there in this room listening to this story and I'm going, that changes how I hear John chapter 11. Do I believe it's possible to be raised from the dead? John chapter 11 is the tipping point to the sequence of events that leads to the saving of the entire world. After John chapter 11, the heat on Jesus is so high that he's about to be crucified. He's about to be killed. What do we got, guys? Thank you. The heat on Jesus is so high at this point. This is the tipping point, John chapter 11, in which Jesus will be crucified because of his ability to raise people from the dead. But before we get into John chapter 11, I just am curious if anybody lately or ever has been disappointed with God. I've got a list of ways in which God has disappointed me. And it's frustrating. Super frustrating. When God doesn't God the way that I think he should. When God doesn't God the way that I think he should. When I want God to God in a different way. I've got a list of disappointments relationally, things that I've asked God to do in the midst of my interactions with other people. I've got a list of things I've asked God to do financially. I've got a list of things that I've asked God to do with my own health and the health of those I love. I've got list upon list upon list of the things that I've been disappointed in God with for not Godding the way that I think he should. There's a story in John chapter 11, and it reveals 3 groups of people who all wish that God would God differently. John chapter 11, verses 1 through 16 say that Jesus was out across the Jordan River, and he was out there because the heat on him was so high, and people were starting to think that he might be the Messiah, and the leaders of the day were starting to think that he was a real threat to their institution and their system. And so he's out in the wilderness hiding. And he gets word out there that someone who he loves, a guy named Lazarus, is sick. And Jesus says this sickness isn't going to lead to death. This sickness is going to be used to glorify God. The sisters of Lazarus had asked Jesus to come and to heal their brother. And Jesus, it says he waited 2 more days. And then he tells his group of disciples, he says, don't worry about it. Lazarus is sleeping. And they're like, oh, he must be asleep because the sickness has taken him over or something. And we'll get to him and Jesus will heal him because that's the kind of stuff that Jesus does. It says, Jesus goes, no, guys. Lazarus is dead. And you got to be thinking Mary and Martha and the Jews that were back in the city of Bethany where Lazarus lives are like, why didn't Jesus come? And the disciples, they kind of give some insight into why Jesus probably didn't go, because if he crosses back over the Jordan and goes into Bethany, Bethany's only 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, Jesus might get arrested and killed. It It's super risky for him to go back into Bethany and do anything around Lazarus. And so you see all these groups of people who have ideas about how God should guide. You have his disciples asking the question, is Lazarus really worth the risk? Is one man, Lazarus, really worth the risk of our rabbi and teacher, Jesus? You have Lazarus himself, who I'm sure at some point heard that they were sending word to Jesus. He's deathly ill. And he cries out, Jesus, come help me. And he dies in his disappointment. And then you have all the Jews around the area. You have specifically the sisters, Mary and Martha, who had sent word to Jesus and asked him to come help the one he loves. And now they're planning a funeral. Everybody has thoughts about how they wish God would God. And these three groups of people all teach us something today. In John chapter 11, verse 17, you see Jesus moves into Bethany. He comes into the village. And in John chapter 11, verse 17, it says, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was finally coming, she went and she met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Anybody have one of those Lord, if you had stories? Lord, if you had Godded the way that I think you should God, what I want would be here today. What I want would be true today. What I desire would be mine today. Jesus, if you had been here, our lives would look completely different. If you did the things that you say you do. If you care about the people that you say you care about. Grief has a funny way of causing us to question God's care and capacity. Listen to what Mary says when she finally comes up, verse 28. When Martha had talked with Jesus for a little while, she went and she called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher's here and he's calling for you. Verse 29 says that when Mary heard it, she rose quickly and she went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Verse 37 tells you what the rest of the crowd was saying. Some of the Jews in attendance that were consoling Mary that had followed her out to Jesus said this question, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Couldn't he have saved the one he loves? Grief causes us to question God's care and God's capacity. When we are grief-stricken, when God disappoints us, and let's be honest, when life disappoints us, because all of us have to deal with life's disappointments. When life disappoints us, we start to wonder if God cares. Does he love me like he says he does? Or we start to question his capabilities. Can he do anything about this? If you were Lazarus waiting on Jesus to arrive, what would be the narrative rolling in your head? Lazarus knew that it was risky for Jesus to come to Bethany. Maybe he starts thinking, I guess I'm not worth the risk. Mary and Martha, as they're there with all of these people grieving, are sitting in a cloud of pain. And our present pain over our past disappointments leaves us to resign to only some future hope. Oh, maybe someday things will be better. Maybe someday God will make all this right. We end up living, and most Christians end up living with last day hope. The present pain, the disappointments are so bad. I believe that God cares. I don't really think he's going to do anything about it. And so one day, I guess we'll all just be raised from the dead and live happily ever after. We resign ourselves to last day hope. But when Jesus actually interacts with Martha, he tells her some significant stuff. In verse 22 of chapter 11, he says that Martha goes into Jesus. She says, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give to you. And Jesus looks at her and says, your brother will rise again. In verse 24, Martha says, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Like all the good Pharisees probably of the day, she believed eventually God will do something about this stuff. Eventually God will fix my pain. Eventually God will stop disappointing us. Eventually, someday, all the stuff that's happened to us in our past and all the things we feel in our present will someday all of a sudden be fine. And Jesus said to her, verse 24, or verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the God of the present tense. Not the God of some future eventually hope. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And then he looks Martha in the eye and he says, do you believe this? Do you? That he's the God of the present tense? Not just the God of someday resurrection, but the God of today resurrection? Do you believe that he is not just the God of last day hope, but that he's the God of today power? Do you believe it? Martha, verse 27, looks at him and says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ. Jesus has not died or rose from the dead yet. She believed him. She believed he was the Christ. She believed he was God before he did what we're celebrating today. That's faith. Faith believes Jesus is who he said he is. He is the bread of life. He is the light of the world. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the door. He is the good shepherd. He is the resurrection and the life. Have you found him? What does he do with all this pain in the midst of this day? Jesus engineers glory from our pain by engaging our grief to empower our belief. Now that's a big statement with a lot of ease in it. They're bolded so you can focus on them. He engineers glory from our pain. He doesn't reduce it or minimize it or deny it or pretend like your pain's not there. He promises to create glory out of our pain. That's what he said in chapter 11, verse 4 to his disciples. He looked at them and he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. And when he's looking at Martha in chapter 11, verse 40, he says to her, didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Your eyes are swollen from crying tears over your dead brother, but those same eyes will see the glory of God. With the eyes you cry, you too will see glory. Because God will engineer glory out of your pain if you bring it to him and present it to him. Lay it at his feet like Mary, the sister, does. She falls at his feet in her grief. And she voices her question, if you had been here, where were you? We needed you. And now here we are in the midst of this funeral. We're weeping and grieving, and Jesus enters into it. He assumes the risk. He goes into Bethany. He engages with the grief. In verse 33, it says that when Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said to her, where have you laid them? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And verse 35 says that Jesus wept. Jesus knew that this was going to be brought forth. This pain was going to be transformed into glory. And yet he still engaged the grief. His own eyes swelled with tears. No other God does that, in case you're wondering. No other God cries with people. No other God is interested in your grief. They're only interested in your offerings and your obedience. Jesus wants all of you. He engages with the grief, and out of that empowers belief. Verse 15 says that when Jesus was talking to his disciples, he said, I'm glad that you guys are seeing this. I'm glad that I wasn't there because I want you to believe. So let's go and see Lazarus. In verse 40, you heard him say it to Martha again. Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? And then in verse 42, it says after he had done this miraculous thing, he says, I know, Father, that you always hear me. Or before he does this miraculous thing, he says, I know you always hear me. I said this on account of all these people standing around, that they may believe that I am God. This whole thing is just one big Lazarus lesson from the rabbi to empower the belief of all of these people. All of these people learn a Lazarus-sized lesson this day. God had come. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Maybe if we could translate it today to our own Lazarus lesson, it would be this: Jesus is the God I need, not the genie I want. He's the God I need, not the genie I want. All of those statements, all of those, if you, Jesus, had Godded the way I want you to God, I would have the genie that I really desire. Not the God my soul needs. If God only does what you ask him to do, you are the God. Jesus knew that he needed to teach his own disciples, the Jews in attendance, a Lazarus lesson. But isn't it unfair to use Lazarus to teach that lesson? Poor Lazarus. I mean, if we could, for just a minute, contemplate, put ourselves in Lazarus's position. In chapter 11, verse 1, it says, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was Mary who had anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. Verse 3 says that the sisters sent to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. Now, this is, to me, a total man thing. He's sick and almost dying, but won't inconvenience his friend Jesus. Instead, his sisters have to call Jesus. I'm sure that all of them are like, you know what? Lazarus is like, I'm fine. You know, I don't know. He just has this, he's completely death-stricken. He's on his deathbed with illness, and he has to die in his disappointment while his sisters had reached out to Jesus. And maybe Lazarus took his final breath and he thought, oh man, someday eventually, heaven's going to be awesome. But I guess today I wasn't worth the risk. And Lazarus dies disappointed. And his sisters and all of those around, they have to prepare his body for burial, and they lay him in a tomb, and he's in that tomb for days. And I don't know where the state of Lazarus' spirit, I only know that they make a point to tell us that the body had been in the tomb for at least 4 days, which according to philosophy of the time means that that's the time at which the spirit would have descended or removed itself from the body. There's no more hope of anything miraculous happening by the time you hit day 4. And then all of a sudden, in chapter 11, in verses 43 and 44, Lazarus, who's wrapped in grave clothes, his body's lying in a tomb, all of a sudden hears, Lazarus, come out! And he looks and it's like, and the stone from the tomb is rolled open. And Lazarus looks like, I'm covered in grave clothes. I died. But I'm not dead now. And he starts walking because the voice told him, come out. And he recognized that's Jesus' voice. And I bet you Lazarus from the place that he was laid in the tomb to the front of the tomb thought, hooray, someday has come. It's the end. Everything is right. And I bet as he walked out and he looked around, he's like, it's only been 4 days. Why are all of you still here? You're definitely not supposed to be here. But why am I covered in these grave clothes? And Jesus says, In verse 44, unbind him and let him go. Unbind him and let him go. Sometime later in John chapter 12, you'll see Mary and Martha hosting another meal at their house. And Lazarus is there, dressed very different. And the story doesn't tell us this. This is complete contemplation, which is a Christian way of saying imagination. But I imagine after Jesus told him to come out, and after Jesus told everybody to unbind him, that Jesus looked Lazarus in the eye and said, I still have a lot of living for you to do. And I wonder if Jesus wants to tell some of us the same thing. Lazarus, you were waiting for someday, but there's power today. Lazarus, you are worth the risk. And I came according to my schedule because I care. You're the one I love. And I have authorized your renewal. By my power, you live. Is there anything I'm not capable of? I would imagine this changed the heart of Lazarus quite a bit. He wasn't just the object lesson for everybody else to learn from. He was a beloved child of God. And what we find from chapter 11 to chapter 12 is that there's a path from the tomb to the table. In fact, there are all these great reversals that happen between chapter 11 and chapter 12. In chapter 11, you have Lazarus laying in a tomb dead. In chapter 12, you have him reclining into the lap of Jesus alive. In chapter 11, you have him wrapped in grave clothes. In chapter 12, you have him seated at a table in feast clothes. But the thing that stands out to me the most isn't the death to life thing from chapter 11 to chapter 12. In chapter 11, we found out, Martha said this when Jesus comes and says, take away the stone from the tomb. We find out that the tomb stinks. Martha's like, by now, there's going to be an odor. It's going to reek. Because there's a rotting body in there. And at chapter 12, Mary, the sister of Lazarus, breaks open a jar of expensive ointment. And the party is filled with a fragrant perfume. And she anoints Jesus' body for burial, we've learned later. But I think the invitation from tomb to table remains. I think today God is inviting us this Easter 2024 to leave behind the odor of the tomb for the perfume of the table. If your life stunk prior to today, you don't have to wait for the last day for things to get better. There's a seat for you in the lap of Jesus, reclined in the presence of Jesus, his beloved child and friend. If you could just kind of, take this forward into today, we probably would have a bunch of TV cameras in Bethany, right? All these different news companies would be circulating the town trying to figure out what happened. I told you this was the tipping point. The popularity for Jesus goes so high at this point, they gotta kill him. All the media sources, everybody there, everybody's in this room, and maybe they're there that night at the feast, and you have one of those, interview type people. Hey, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, what happened here? Please tell us. Breaking news: Lazarus back from the dead. What did all of you learn in the midst of this? I think you would hear Martha say, I learned that one right there at the table, Jesus is the God of the present. He's the God of the present. He's the God of today power, not just tomorrow hope. I believe in him. I think all of us would do well to learn a lesson from Martha's confession today and ask ourselves the question, do I believe that he is the God of the present tense? He is the resurrection and the life. I think that's what Martha would say. And then they move over to Mary. They say, Mary, you seem to have broken a very expensive perfume. That was probably your dowry. What does this mean? You anointed Jesus' feet with your wedding gift? How could you do that? That was so expensive. That was so frivolous. That was so crazy. And she might have looked and said, you know what? I did. But that's because all of me belongs to him. All of me belongs to him. He is worthy of all my commitment, all my hope. He is the one my soul longs for. Everything belongs to him. Martha's confession and Mary's commitment are beautiful lessons for us to learn from the family today. And then the camera pans over to Lazarus, right? He's sitting there with Jesus right next to him. Lazarus, what did you learn? What did you learn? I think Lazarus said, I learned how much he cares about me. He assumed the risk. I learned what he's capable of. He authorized my renewal. And I think you would find in Lazarus a new courage. You know what happens to Lazarus? One of those great reversals that happen. Lazarus ends up on the religious leaders' most wanted list. In chapter 12, it says they're seeking to kill Lazarus because people aren't supposed to come back from the dead. And many people are believing because God has been engineering glory from pain. He's been engaging with grief, and he is empowering belief through it. And people are looking at Lazarus, and he says, you know, Lazarus, what do you think about it? You're on the religious leaders' most wanted list. And he says, you know what? Actually, I've been written in the Lamb's book of life. I think Lazarus found new courage that day. I think Martha made a confession. I think Mary found a commitment. I think Lazarus found new courage that day to walk in the power of what he believed. And I think if you ask them all collectively, what has the family learned in all of this? They say, we cannot believe what God does for those he loves. And then the camera pans to Jesus, and the microphone moves in front of him. And Jesus says, wait until you see what I do next.